The war had been going on for 3 years, and Queen Vexara stood on the bridge of her massive warship, called the Crimson Talon, looking at all the damage reports that floated in front of her like glowing screens in the air, and her heart felt heavy because the news was not good at all. But what worried her most was not the battle damage to her ships, or the lost soldiers, or even the enemy fleet that kept pushing closer to her homeworlds. No, what truly troubled her was the armor that lay broken in her royal armory below, the ceremonial battle armor that had been passed down through 17 generations of warrior queens in her family. And this armor was not just some protective gear that soldiers wore into battle. It was the very symbol of her authority and power, embedded with technology so ancient and mysterious that even the greatest engineers in her empire could not fully understand how it worked or how it was made so long ago. During the last big fight with the enemy fleet called the Zenthari, something had gone terribly wrong when an energy surge, like a massive wave of electricity, had cascaded through the armor's power system, and this surge had fused all the delicate crystalline circuits inside and warped the quantum-forged metal plates on the outside, making them bend and twist in ways they should never bend. And when she had taken off the armor after barely escaping with her life, she had known immediately that something was very wrong because the armor felt dead and cold instead of alive and warm, like it always had before, and she had called for her 3 finest engineers, the best minds in the entire Calith Empire, and they had examined the armor for days, taking readings and running tests and arguing among themselves in technical language she barely understood. And finally they had come to her with sad faces and told her what she had feared most, that the armor was beyond repair, that it required materials that no longer existed anywhere in the known galaxy, and techniques that had been lost to time thousands of years ago when the ancient ones who built it had vanished. Her second in command, a loyal soldier named Commander Thralix, approached her carefully because he knew she was in a foul mood these days, and he said in his clicking voice that the diplomatic summit with the human coalition called the Terran Coalition was coming up in just 6 days, and protocol demanded that she wear the royal armor to show her authority and power to all the other species who would be watching. And she snapped at him that she already knew this, her voice sharp enough to cut through steel, because the humans had only entered the galactic stage about 5 years ago, appearing out of nowhere from a little planet called Earth in a quiet corner of the galaxy. Yet they had already proven themselves to be formidable allies against the Zenthari threat with their strange weapons and unusual tactics. And this summit would formalize their alliance and make it official. But appearing without her armor would signal weakness to every species watching, and her enemies would see it as an opportunity to challenge her rule. Meanwhile, far below in the lower maintenance decks of a human ship, a man named Jake Porter wiped thick grease from his hands onto a dirty rag and surveyed the alien power conduit he had just repaired, feeling satisfied with his work. And he was a 32-year-old mechanic from a place called Ohio back on Earth, a simple farm boy who had grown up fixing tractors and cars, and he had joined the Terran Coalition Navy as an enlisted technician because he wanted to see the stars and maybe make some money to send back home to his family, expecting to fix human ships and work on human technology that he understood. But instead he had somehow become the go-to specialist for alien technology that baffled even the xeno-engineers with their fancy advanced degrees and years of study, because Jake had a gift for understanding how things worked just by looking at them and touching them and listening to the sounds they made. His chief, a lieutenant named Brady Walsh, appeared at the doorway of the cramped maintenance room and said he had a weird job for Jake, explaining that the Calith Queen's personal armor was completely fried and broken, and their own people could not fix it no matter how hard they tried. And Command wanted to know if Jake could take a look at it as a diplomatic courtesy thing, just to show goodwill between allies even if he could not actually fix it. And Jake raised an eyebrow in surprise and said they were asking a human mechanic to fix their ancient royal artifact, and that was either a huge compliment or they were really desperate. Probably both. And Brady laughed and said Jake had clearance to access their royal armory, and he should try not to start an interstellar incident or get himself killed. 2 hours later, Jake found himself standing in the Crimson Talon's royal armory, a vast room with high ceilings and walls covered in weapons and trophies from 100 battles. And he stared at what looked like a sculpture made of flowing metal and crystalline circuits that seemed to glow with an inner light, even though the armor was supposedly dead. And the armor was incredibly beautiful in a way that human technology never was, organic in its curves and shapes, yet clearly technological and advanced, like something alive that had been frozen in time. And several Calith guards watched him with their 4 eyes each, their hands resting on plasma weapons that could turn him into ash in a second, and they did not look happy about a human being allowed near their queen's sacred armor. Jake asked politely if he could touch the armor and examine it, and the lead guard, a female soldier with dark purple scales, clicked her mandibles together in what he had learned was reluctant agreement, and she said in a threatening voice that the queen would have his head if he damaged the armor any further. And Jake just nodded calmly because he had heard worse threats from angry sergeants back in basic training. And he pulled out his diagnostic scanner, a modified Terran device that he had personally upgraded and tinkered with over the years to read alien energy signatures and power flows. Because the standard issue scanner was garbage and could barely detect anything useful. As he ran the scanner slowly over the armor, moving it across every surface and joint and seam, his eyes widened in surprise and wonder because the technology was incredibly advanced, far beyond anything humans had made or even most alien species he had worked with. But despite its complexity, the underlying principles were universal and familiar, based on the same laws of physics that governed everything in the universe. And whoever had built this armor thousands of years ago had understood quantum field manipulation at a level that made current K-Lith technology look primitive and simple by comparison, like comparing a computer to an abacus. But they had also built it with practical engineering sense, with every part serving a clear purpose and nothing wasted. Jake muttered to himself as he examined the damage, seeing where the energy surge had fused the crystalline circuits together like melted glass and where the quantum-forged plates had warped under impossible stress, and he pulled out his toolkit, an old battered case that he had carried since his first day in the Navy, filled with tools from Earth and tools he had collected from a dozen alien species, and he said quietly but confidently that he thought he could work with this and maybe fix it, and the guards looked at each other in disbelief because their own master engineers had said it was impossible. And here was this human who had barely looked at it for 10 minutes saying he could repair what their greatest minds could not. Jake spent the next 18 hours in that armory without stopping except to eat a few ration bars that Brady smuggled past the suspicious guards. And he barely slept because his mind was racing with ideas and solutions, and the Kalith armor was truly a masterwork of integrated systems, where each component affected dozens of others in complex ways that created a whole greater than the sum of its parts. And conventional repair methods were completely impossible, because removing any single piece would destabilize the entire structure and cause everything to collapse like pulling one card from a house of cards, and the Kalith engineers had tried that approach and failed miserably. But Jake did not think in conventional ways because that was not how he had learned to fix things. He had grown up on a farm in rural Ohio, where money was always tight and replacement parts were expensive. So his grandfather had taught him that improvisation was not just useful but necessary, a way of life where you made do with what you had and found creative solutions instead of buying new parts. And later in the Navy he had learned that different alien species technologies often shared common foundations, despite looking completely different on the surface, like different languages all describing the same mathematical truths or physical laws. And this understanding had made him valuable because he could see past the superficial differences to the underlying principles that connected everything the armor's power matrix had fused, because the crystalline circuits inside could not dissipate the massive energy surge fast enough, like trying to pour an ocean through a straw, and the energy had nowhere to go, so it had melted everything together, and the Kalith engineers had tried to replace the damaged crystals with new ones. But that approach required disassembling systems that were quantum locked to each other, meaning they existed in a state where changing one automatically affected the others, and breaking those locks would destroy the armor completely, so they had given up and declared it hopeless. Jake's solution was elegantly simple in concept but required precise execution, and instead of replacing the fused crystals, he decided to create micro-bypass channels using conductive gel from Terran emergency repair kits, the same stuff they used to patch hull breaches temporarily. And this gel could carry energy around the damaged areas like water flowing around a rock in a stream. And then he used a resonance generator, a tool he had borrowed from the ship's medical bay that was normally used for breaking up kidney stones in patients, and he carefully vibrated the fused crystals at specific frequencies, slowly separating their atomic bonds without disrupting the delicate quantum locks that held everything together. And it was like performing surgery with a hammer, but somehow making it work through sheer patience and understanding. For the warped armor plates that had bent and twisted under the stress, Jake employed an old metalworking trick that his grandfather had taught him, when they were fixing a tractor that had been in a bad accident. And the trick was controlled heating and cooling to redistribute internal stress in the metal, making it want to return to its original shape, and using a modified plasma torch that he carefully calibrated to very specific temperatures. He heated small sections of the quantum-forged metal at precisely timed intervals, then cooled them with liquid nitrogen that the Caliph used for their weapon systems, and slowly, incredibly slowly, he coaxed the metal back into its original elegant curves, and the guards watched in amazement as the impossible happened before their eyes. The guards had been suspicious and hostile at first, but as the hours passed and they watched Jake work with such focus and care, their attitude changed to fascination, and they saw how he moved with confidence but not arrogance, talking to himself constantly as he worked, explaining each step out loud as if teaching an invisible student. And he treated the ancient armor with respect but not fear, touching it gently but firmly like a doctor examining a patient. And when one particularly delicate procedure required steadier hands than Jake possessed, after working for so many hours without sleep, his hands shaking slightly from exhaustion and too much coffee, he did not give up or make excuses but instead rigged a micro-stabilization field using spare parts from his toolkit and a Caliph medical scanner that one of the guards reluctantly lent him, and the field held his tools perfectly steady while he worked on the most delicate repairs. Finally, after what felt like days but was really just 18 hours, Jake stepped back from the armor and wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a smear of grease across his face, and he said in a tired but satisfied voice that the guards should give it a full power cycle test, running it through all its systems from minimum to maximum output. But he thought she was good now, fixed and ready to work, and the lead guard immediately activated her communicator and spoke rapidly in her own language to someone. And within minutes, Commander Thralix himself arrived in the armory, his scales flushed with colors that Jake's cultural database told him indicated extreme surprise and disbelief. Thralix ran a thorough diagnostic using Caliph equipment, checking every system and subsystem and cross-referencing the results against the armor's original specifications from when it was first made, thousands of years ago, and his mandibles clicked rapidly in a rhythm that clearly showed he was shocked by what he was seeing. And finally he turned to Jake and said in a voice filled with wonder that this was impossible, that not only was the armor functional again, but the power efficiency was actually 7% higher than it had been before the damage, better than it had ever been in recorded history, and he demanded to know how Jake had accomplished this miracle. Jake just shrugged, his exhaustion making him more honest than diplomatic, and he said he had simply paid attention to what the armor wanted to do and helped it get there. That technology usually told you what it needed if you were willing to listen to it, and you just had to understand the language it spoke, which was the universal language of physics and engineering. And Threlix stared at him for a long moment before saying that the Queen must be informed immediately about this development. Queen Vixara stood in her private chambers, wearing the repaired armor for the first time since the battle, and the moment the helmet sealed around her head with a soft hiss, she felt the familiar rush of connection as the armor's systems interfaced with her neural patterns, linking her mind directly to the armor's functions. But something was different this time, something better, and the power flowed more smoothly through the circuits like oil instead of honey, and the response time between her thoughts and the armor's actions had decreased noticeably, and there was a stability and strength she had never experienced before, not even when her mother had worn this armor or her grandmother before that. She moved through a series of ancient combat forms that every Caliph warrior learned, testing the armor's response to quick movements and sudden changes in direction, and the armor responded perfectly to every command, flowing with her body like a second skin, and it was better than perfect, better than it had ever been in 347 years of use, and she felt tears forming in her eyes because she had thought this connection was lost forever, this link to her ancestors and her heritage. She commanded her guards to bring her the human who had repaired the armor, because she needed to meet this person and understand how he had done what her greatest engineers could not. And Jake was halfway back to the Terran vessel, walking through the corridor and thinking about getting some real sleep in his own bunk, when armed Caliph guards suddenly surrounded him, and his hand instinctively moved toward the sidearm on his hip, before Brady's voice crackled urgently in his earpiece telling him to stay calm, that he was not being arrested, that the Queen wanted to see him, and this was actually a huge honor, not a threat. And Jake relaxed slightly but muttered under his breath that they could have led with that information, instead of scaring him half to death. The throne room was vast and intimidating, decorated with battle trophies from dozens of worlds, weapons and armor and flags from defeated enemies, and the ceiling was so high that Jake could barely see it in the dim lighting. And Queen Vexara sat on a throne that seemed to grow organically from the floor itself, like a living tree made of metal, and she wore the repaired armor which gleamed under the chamber's lighting, like it was made of liquid silver, and she was imposing and terrifying. Easily 8 feet tall with 4 powerful arms and scales that shifted colors with her emotions, currently showing patterns that Jake could not interpret, even with his cultural database helping him. Jake snapped to attention and gave a crisp military salute. Uncertain of proper Calith customs but defaulting to the military protocol he knew, and Queen Vexara spoke in a voice that resonated through her armor's speakers, translated into English by the neural implant in Jake's head. And she asked if he was Jake Porter of the Terran Coalition Navy with the enlisted rank of E5. And he confirmed that he was, adding the respectful title of Your Majesty because that seemed appropriate when talking to a queen. Then Vexara asked a question that made Jake's blood run cold, demanding to know who had given him permission to modify her armor's power matrix. And Jake felt panic rising in his chest as he stammered an explanation that he had not meant to modify anything, that he had been very careful not to change any core systems, that he had only created bypass channels to work around the damage and restore function, and he was preparing to apologize profusely when Vexara raised one hand to silence him. She told him that he misunderstood her question, that she was not displeased with his work. Quite the opposite, actually, but she was deeply curious about something, and she explained that her armor had been in her family for 347 standard years, maintained over that time by 17 master artificers, each one trained for decades in the ancient arts and secret techniques passed down through generations. Yet a human mechanic with no formal training in Calith, technology and no background in artifact class, equipment had not only repaired damage that those masters deemed completely impossible, but had actually improved the armor's function beyond its original specifications, and she wanted to understand how this was possible. Jake relaxed a bit and thought carefully about his answer, and he said respectfully that he thought his lack of formal training was exactly why he could fix it, that he did not know what was supposed to be impossible, so he just focused on what needed to be done. And honestly, good engineering was good engineering no matter which species built it because the principles were universal. Gravity worked the same way for everyone and energy always followed the same rules. And if you understood those basic principles, you could work with any technology. Something shifted in Vexara's scales, and the patterns changed to colors that Jake's database identified as indicating respect and interest. And she stood up from her throne, her armor moving silently and fluidly with her body, and she walked closer to Jake, who had to fight the urge to back away from this imposing figure. And she told him to speak freely and asked what he saw when he looked at her armor, not as a mechanic trying to fix it, but as someone observing it for the first time. Jake considered the question very carefully, because he sensed that his answer mattered more than he understood, and he said honestly that he saw something built by people who understood that form follows function, that every curve and circuit and component had a clear purpose, that it was not just technology but also art, and art was meant to be appreciated and understood and learned from, not just preserved behind glass like a museum piece that nobody could touch. And the people who built this armor thousands of years ago had wanted it to be used and maintained and passed down, not worshipped from a distance. Vexara's scales shifted again to patterns of what looked like satisfaction, and she made a decision that surprised everyone in the throne room, announcing that Jake would attend the upcoming diplomatic summit as part of the Terran delegation because she wished for him to be present when she demonstrated the armor to all the assembled species and their leaders. And Jake immediately protested that he was just a mechanic, that surely a trained diplomat would be more appropriate for such an important political event. But Vexara would not hear his objections. She told him that he was the mechanic who fixed what master artificers could not, the human who saw past impossibility to find solutions, and that kind of thinking was precisely what their alliance needed in these difficult times. And besides, she added, with what Jake was learning to recognize as amusement in her scale patterns, she wished to see the faces of her political rivals when she told them that a human E5, the equivalent of a low-ranking enlisted soldier, had accomplished what their master engineers with decades of training and advanced degrees could not accomplish, and that would be a delicious moment of diplomatic theater. The summit was held on a neutral station called Concordia Prime, a massive structure that had been built jointly by a dozen different species after the First War with the Xanthari, and it floated in space near a beautiful nebula that painted the stars in colors of purple and blue and gold, and representatives from 47 different civilizations gathered in the Grand Hall, which was a perfect sphere made of transparent alamasteel that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding cosmos. And Jake stood uncomfortably in his dress uniform among the Terran delegation, led by Admiral Christina Hayes, and he had never been in a room with so much concentrated political power, and every instinct told him that he did not belong here with all these important people. The summit's first day focused on boring military cooperation protocols and resource-sharing agreements, discussions about fleet positions and supply lines and communication networks, and Jake tried to stay invisible in the back of the room, taking notes on his data pad and avoiding eye contact with anyone important, and he hoped that everyone would forget he was there. But he had a sinking feeling that Queen Vexara had other plans for him. On the second day of the summit, Queen Vexara took the floor during the main session, and she wore her restored armor, which gleamed magnificently under the hall's lighting like a living thing made of starlight, and murmurs rippled through the entire assembly because everyone present knew the history of that armor and the story of its supposedly irreparable damage, and they had all heard that master artificers from 3 different species had examined it and declared it beyond saving. So seeing it now in perfect condition was shocking. Vexara began speaking in her resonant voice that carried through the hall's perfect acoustics, and she said that honored representatives all knew the Calith Empire took great pride in their technological heritage, that they preserved the achievements of their ancestors and guarded those secrets jealously. And 3 cycles ago her royal armor, a genuine relic of the ancient forge masters who lived thousands of years before, had been damaged beyond repair according to every expert who examined it, and her finest artificers, trained in traditions spanning centuries and holding knowledge passed down through countless generations, had declared it completely lost and unsalvageable. She paused for dramatic effect, letting the tension build in the room, and her scales displayed patterns of deep satisfaction as she continued, saying that yet today she wore this armor, fully functional and actually improved beyond its original specifications, performing better than it had in 300 years. And this miraculous repair was not accomplished by Calith artificers despite their skill and training, nor by the renowned technomancers of Zythros who were famous across the galaxy for their ability to work with ancient technologies, nor by any of the species that the galaxy traditionally considered technological superiors and masters of lost arts. Then Vexara gestured directly toward Jake, and he felt every single eye in that enormous room turn to look at him. Representatives from 47 different species all staring at once, and he wanted desperately to disappear, or sink through the floor or be anywhere else in the entire universe. And she announced that this impossible repair was accomplished by Jake Porter, a Terran enlisted mechanic with no formal training in xenotechnology, in less than 1 planetary rotation, which was about 20 hours, using what his people casually called spare parts, and something he had referred to simply as common sense. The hall erupted into complete chaos, with species arguing loudly in multiple languages, and the translation system struggled to keep up with the flood of simultaneous conversations, and the Zythros ambassador, a being made of pure crystalline energy that pulsed with light, began glowing brightly with what Jake's cultural database identified as extreme indignation and offense, and the ambassador declared loudly that this was completely impossible, that the quantum forge techniques required to work with artifact-class armor were lost to all but the most ancient species in the galaxy, and no newcomer species like humanity could possibly possess such knowledge. Admiral Hayes stood up smoothly from her seat, moving with the grace and confidence of someone used to command, and she said calmly that humanity had a saying that the ambassador might find interesting, that necessity is the mother of invention, and humans had only recently joined the galactic community, which meant they had not yet learned what was supposed to be impossible, and Petty Officer Porter exemplified the human approach to problem-solving perfectly, which was to focus on what needed to be done rather than on why it supposedly could not be done. The Valorian delegate, a massive being with 6 arms and extensive cybernetic enhancements covering half his body, leaned forward in his seat and asked in a deep rumbling voice whether this human had studied Calith technology for years before attempting the repair. And Jake spoke up before he could stop himself, his natural honesty overriding diplomatic caution. And he said he had 18 hours with the armor and nothing more, and he immediately apologized for speaking out of turn because he knew he was just an enlisted man and not supposed to talk in these high-level meetings. But he wanted to be completely clear that he was not special or extraordinary, that any good mechanic could have done what he did because humans just thought about problems differently than species with ancient stable technologies. The Valorian demanded that Jake explain what he meant by thinking differently, and Jake glanced at Admiral Hayes, who gave him a barely visible nod of permission, and he took a deep breath and explained that most of the alien technology he had worked with over the past few years was designed by species that had possessed stable technology for centuries or even millennia, and those species built things to last forever and to maintain ancient traditions, which was admirable and produced incredibly durable equipment. But it also meant they sometimes forgot the first principles that made those technologies work in the first place, the basic rules of physics and engineering that underlay everything. He continued, feeling more confident as he spoke, explaining that humans were still figuring everything out, that they broke things constantly and fixed them wrong and learned from mistakes and iterated and improved through trial and error. And they did not have thousands of years of tradition telling them the right way to do things, so instead they tried everything until something worked, and this approach meant they were comfortable with experimentation and failure in ways that older species were not, and sometimes that fresh perspective let them see solutions that experts missed because the experts were constrained by their knowledge of what should be impossible. The summit continued for 3 more days after that dramatic moment, but the entire narrative and tone had shifted completely, and species that had previously viewed humanity as junior partners, useful allies but not equals, began asking detailed questions about human engineering methods and educational systems and problem-solving approaches. And Jake found himself pulled into unofficial meetings where he explained techniques his grandfather had taught him on the farm, to beings with centuries of advanced education and multiple doctoral degrees. On the final evening, Queen Vexara hosted a private dinner for select delegates, just a small group of the most important leaders, and Jake was extremely surprised to find himself invited to this exclusive event, and he was seated between Admiral Hayes and Commander Threlix at a table that overlooked the nebula through the station's transparent walls, and servers brought dishes from a dozen different worlds, foods that Jake had never seen before, and some that he was not entirely sure were actually food. Vexara raised a glass in a toast and said that Jake Porter had given her much to consider, that for generations her people had focused entirely on preserving the achievements of their ancestors, and they had become curators of greatness rather than creators of new greatness, and watching Jake work had shown her that they had allowed reverence to become stagnation, that they treated ancient technology with so much respect that they were afraid to truly understand it. Jake quickly said that he had not meant any disrespect to Calith traditions or their ancestors, that he understood how important cultural heritage was, but Vexara waved away his concern and told him that no offense was taken, that he had spoken truth that needed speaking even if it was uncomfortable, and watching him work had taught her something valuable about the difference between reverence and understanding, and she explained that he had treated her ancient armor with genuine respect, but not with paralyzing fear, that he had seen it as a machine that needed fixing, rather than a relic too precious and sacred to touch, and this was the gift that humanity brought to their alliance, the courage to treat the impossible as merely difficult, to see ancient mysteries as problems waiting to be solved, rather than secrets that must remain forever hidden. The Zithros ambassador, who had been so indignant during the public session, pulsed with softer light now and admitted that he had been skeptical at first, even angry at the suggestion that a newcomer species could accomplish what ancient civilizations could not. But he had reviewed all the technical reports in detail, studying every measurement and test result, and he had to acknowledge that the human solutions were elegant in their simplicity, and perhaps all the older species had overcomplicated their understanding of ancient technologies, adding unnecessary layers of mysticism and ritual where none had existed originally when the technologies were first created. Admiral Hayes raised her glass and proposed a toast to cooperation between species, where each civilization contributed their unique strengths to the alliance, and she said that the Caliph provided stability and honor, and a connection to ancient wisdom. And the Zethros brought deep knowledge and mastery of energy manipulation, and humanity contributed their particular talent for breaking things and then fixing them in ways that probably should not work, but somehow did anyway, and laughter rippled around the table as the translation systems captured the humor and transmitted it across the species barriers. And even Vexura's scales shifted to patterns of genuine amusement. After the dinner ended and the guests began to leave, Jake stood alone on an observation deck, watching ships of all sizes and shapes come and go from Concordia Prime, vessels from dozens of species docking and undocking in an endless dance, and he was lost in thought about how strange his life had become when Commander Thralix joined him. His mandibles clicking in the friendly rhythm that Jake had learned indicated casual conversation, rather than official business, and Thralix asked why Jake seemed troubled when he should be celebrating his success. Jake admitted that just a week ago, he had been fixing simple power conduits in the lower decks of a human ship, doing routine maintenance that nobody noticed or cared about, and now suddenly he was attending diplomatic dinners with queens and ambassadors, and the whole situation did not feel real. It felt like a dream or a mistake, like someone would realize he did not belong there and send him back to where he came from. And Thralix made a sound that the translator interpreted as thoughtful agreement, and he said that perhaps this discomfort with his new status was actually humanity's greatest strength. Thralix explained that humans did not limit themselves by worrying about what felt real or appropriate, or proper according to social hierarchies, that they simply did what needed doing regardless of their rank or status. And this practical approach was exactly what the galaxy needed right now. And then he told Jake that Queen Vexura wished to offer him a formal position as liaison engineer to the Caliph fleet, and he would hold the rank of Master Artificer, which was equivalent to a captain in human terms, a massive jump in responsibility and prestige. Jake's eyes widened in shock, and he stammered that this was an incredible honor. But he was just a mechanic, just an enlisted guy who was good with tools. And Thralix's scales shifted to amused patterns as he pointed out that Jake was the mechanic who had fixed what master artificers with decades of training could not repair. The human who saw solutions where others saw only impossible problems, and that was precisely what their alliance needed. People who did not accept limitations, and besides, he added, the Queen had 3 more suits of artifact-class armor sitting in storage that required maintenance, and she now refused to let anyone except Jake near them, because she trusted his judgment and his skills. Jake laughed despite himself and said that when Thralix put it that way, it made sense. But he would need to request an official transfer through his chain of command, because the military had procedures for these things, and Admiral Hayes appeared behind them as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. And she told Jake that the transfer was already approved, that the Terran coalition saw great value in having their people integrated with allied fleets, and Jake would retain his rank and position with the human navy, while simultaneously serving as Master Artificer to the Caliph, making him the first human to ever hold that prestigious position. Jake muttered that there was no pressure then, his voice heavy with sarcasm, and Admiral Hayes smiled and told him that he had already proven himself beyond any doubt, that he should just keep doing what he did best, which was fixing things that needed fixing, and not worrying about what was supposed to be impossible according to conventional wisdom. 3 months later, Jake stood in his expanded workshop aboard the Crimson Talon, and the space was much larger than his old maintenance closet, filled with equipment from a dozen species, and he was training a mixed group of human and Caliph engineers, young people eager to learn his methods. And on the workbench before them lay components from multiple species technologies as part of a joint research project to develop hybrid systems that combined the best elements of different design philosophies. Jake explained to his students that the key to working with unfamiliar technology was to respect the engineering without being paralyzed by it, that every species in the galaxy had contributed amazing technologies, but they all followed the same fundamental principles, and energy had to go somewhere. Materials had stress tolerances, and quantum effects behaved predictably even when they seemed magical or mysterious. And a young Caliph engineer named Kelvara raised her hand and asked if it was true that Jake had no formal training in xenotechnology before he repaired the Queen's armor. Jake confirmed that it was true, that he had just applied basic mechanical principles and had not been afraid to try unconventional solutions because he did not know any better, And that was what he was trying to teach all of them. The courage to experiment and to fail and to learn and to try again. And this human approach to problem-solving complemented the Caliph reverence for excellence and precision perfectly, creating something better than either approach alone could achieve.